The static was a living thing. It hissed and spat from the main speakers in the Tactical Operations Center, a sound like tearing silk amplified 1,000 times. On the holographic map dominating the room, a cluster of 4 green icons, call sign Pathfinder, pulsed weakly inside a deep, jagged canyon marked in hostile red. Outside the canyon, a weather system the color of a fresh bruise churned across the display, a swirling mass of isobars and lightning strike indicators. The storm was moving in fast, a wall of wind and ice that would make the canyon impassable in less than 30 minutes. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood with his hands locked behind his back, his posture as rigid as the steel beams supporting the ceiling. His gaze was fixed on the map, his jaw a tight line of disapproval. He hated situations like this. They were messy, unpredictable, and they defied the neat, logical progression of a well-planned operation. Pathfinder had been compromised during a reconnaissance mission. A simple in and out had turned into a desperate fight for survival when a previously unknown enemy spotter had caught their movement. Now they were pinned down, taking sporadic but accurate mortar fire from a ridge they couldn't see, with an entire mechanized platoon closing on their position. The window for air support was not just closing, it was being slammed shut and bolted by the storm of the century. Status on the extraction window? Thorne's voice was flat, cutting through the low murmur of the controllers. A young lieutenant, his face pale under the blue glow of the monitors, cleared his throat. Negative, sir. The storm front has accelerated. We're seeing wind shear in excess of 100 knots at the canyon mouth. Zero visibility. Any bird we send in there, rotary or fixed wing, is a guaranteed loss. Thorne nodded slowly, the movement tight and controlled. It was the answer he expected. It was the only logical answer. And the ground route. Enemy armor has cut off the western pass. The eastern approach is a 3-day hike over impassable terrain. They're boxed in. Colonel, the room fell silent. The only sound the electric snarl of the static from Pathfinder's compromised comms link. Through the noise, a strained voice crackled, each word a struggle. Fire mission, danger close, cannot repeat, cannot hold. The transmission died, swallowed by another wave of atmospheric noise. Thorne's expression didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. He was a man who believed in rules, in procedures, in the cold calculus of acceptable risk. For elite operators were an asset, a valuable one. But a $5 million aircraft and its pilot were also an asset. Risking one asset to save another with a near-zero probability of success was not just bad strategy. It was dereliction of duty. He saw the faces of the operators in the room, the hope draining from them, replaced by a grim resignation. They knew the math as well as he did. No pilot could fly into that. No aircraft could survive it. It was over. He was about to give the order to stand down, to retask the satellites for damage assessment after the fact, when a quiet voice spoke from the back of the room. There is a way. Heads turned. Major Anya Sharma stood near the doorway, still in her flight suit. She hadn't been on the duty roster, but she was always here when things went sideways. She was of average height, with a wiry strength that was easy to underestimate. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and her face was a mask of calm focus. Her eyes, however, missed nothing. They were fixed on the tactical display, analyzing the storm's movement, the canyon's topography, the enemy positions. She wasn't looking at the problem, she was looking through it. Thorne's gaze settled on her, his skepticism a palpable force. Sharma was a brilliant pilot, her record was undeniable. But she was also a maverick, an instinct-driven flyer who treated regulations as mere suggestions. She made him uneasy. "Major," he said, his tone clipped and dismissive. "I admire your optimism, but we are not sending a pilot to their death." The mission is scrubbed. Sharma's eyes finally met his. They were dark and unreadable. The storm has a thermal inversion layer at 300 feet. The canyon floor will be shielded from the worst of the shear. It creates a tunnel, a narrow one, but it's there. The lieutenant at the weather console frantically typed, his eyes widening as new data scrolled across his screen. "Sir, she's right. It's a freak phenomenon, a one-in-a-million event, but the models confirm it. There's a stable corridor of air just above the canyon floor." Thorne's expression hardened. A fluke of meteorology didn't change the facts on the ground. A tunnel full of enemy air defenses, multiple ZSU positions, and reported manpads teams. You'd be flying into a kill box with no visibility and no room to maneuver. It's suicide. It's a calculated risk, Sharma countered, her voice still quiet but unyielding. Not a calculation I'm willing to make. Major, Thorne turned his back on her. A clear dismissal. The decision is final. We will not lose an aircraft and a pilot on a fool's errand. Stand down. The finality in his voice was absolute. The operators in the room slumped. The brief spark of hope extinguished. The static hissed, a final, mocking commentary on the fate of Pathfinder. Sharma did not argue. She did not raise her voice or challenge his authority further. She simply gave a short, almost imperceptible nod, turned, and walked out of the Tactical Operations Center. But she wasn't heading for the barracks. She was heading for the hangars. For her, the conversation was not over. The calculation was just beginning. In the echoing expanse of Hangar 7, the air smelled of hydraulic fluid, ozone, and cold steel. Her jet, a heavily modified F-15EX Strike Eagle, sat under the sodium lights, a creature of menacing grace. Its official designation was 78-049, but to her and the ground crew, it was simply the Ghost. The name fit. Its radar-absorbent paint was a patchwork of shades, from matte black to deep charcoal, scarred and faded from missions that never made the official reports. It didn't look new or pristine. It looked lethal, a tool honed by relentless use. Airman Leo Vance, barely 20 years old, was running a final diagnostic check when he saw her approaching. He felt the familiar mix of awe and anxiety that always accompanied Major Sharma. She moved with a quiet purpose that made everyone around her feel like they were moving in slow motion. She didn't speak much, but she didn't need to. She communicated with a glance, a nod, a gesture. Leo had been assigned as her dedicated crew chief 6 months ago, and he'd learned more from watching her pre-flight ritual than he had in all his technical training. It wasn't just a checklist for her. It was a conversation with the machine. She didn't acknowledge him at first. Her eyes were on the aircraft. She began her walk around, her gloved hand trailing along the fuselage, fingers tracing seams and rivets. It was a tactile inspection, feeling for the slightest imperfection, the smallest sign of stress. She stopped at the portside engine intake. A long, jagged scar ran across the titanium housing, a wound from a surface-to-air missile over some forgotten desert. The repair was flawless, but she always paused there, her fingertips resting on the raised weld. Leo saw it as a moment of silent respect, a shared memory between pilot and plane. "Everything is green, Major," Leo said, his voice a little too loud in the quiet hangar. "Fuel is topped. Ordnance is loaded per standard sortie." Sharma looked at the weapons slung under the wings. Standard configuration. Air-to-air missiles on the wingtips, a mix of general-purpose bombs and guided munitions on the pylons. "It wasn't right for this." "Change it," she said. Her voice was low, calm. "Replace the GBU-12s with 8 small-diameter bombs. And I need 2 pods of Hydra rockets. High explosive. Swap the 8M-9XS for 2 more fuel tanks." Leo blinked. That was a ground attack loadout for a saturated target environment, designed for loitering and multiple strikes. And the extra fuel. She was planning on staying a while. "Major." Colonel Thorne gave the stand-down order. "The flight line is closed." Sharma finally looked at him. Her gaze wasn't intimidating, but it was incredibly intense. It made you feel like she could see every decision you'd ever made. "The flight line is closed to scheduled sorties, Airman." "This is not a scheduled sortie." She walked over to her locker and began to suit up. The process was methodical, practiced. The G-suit, the survival vest, the helmet. Each piece of gear was settled into place with an economy of motion. On the shoulder of her flight suit was a small, circular patch, so faded and worn that the design was barely visible. It wasn't standard issue. It depicted a solitary gray hawk against a storm cloud. Leo had never asked about it. He knew it was a relic from a unit that no longer officially existed, a unit that specialized in the impossible. Thorne might see a pilot defying orders. Leo saw a professional preparing for work. He looked at the ordnance request on his datapad, then back at the Major, now climbing the ladder into the cockpit. He knew what would happen to him if he rearmed this aircraft without authorization. A court-martial was the best-case scenario. But then he thought of the crackling static from the TOC, the strained voice from the canyon. He looked at the scarred flank of the Ghost, and at the unwavering focus of the woman settling into its cockpit. He made his decision. "I'll get the munitions team," Leo said, turning toward the intercom. "It'll take 10 minutes, Sharma didn't reply. She was already flipping switches, the cockpit coming to life around her, its screens bathing her in a soft green glow. The canopy hissed shut, sealing her in her own world. The sound of the auxiliary power unit whirring to life was the only answer he needed. 10 minutes later, the Ghost rolled out of the hangar, its reconfigured weapons clinging to its pylons like deadly parasites. The storm was no longer on the horizon. It was here. Rain lashed against the reinforced hangar doors, and the wind howled like a banshee. As Sharma taxied toward the runway, she bypassed the normal chain of command. She didn't call the tower for clearance. She switched to a discreet, encrypted channel. "Thorn," she said. Her voice was devoid of insubordination, a simple statement of fact. "I'm taking off." In the TOC, a stunned silence fell over the room. On the main screen, a new icon had appeared on the airfield, taxiing toward the main runway. Unidentified, but they all knew who it was. Thorn grabbed the microphone, his face a mask of cold fury. "Major Sharma, you will stand down immediately. That is a direct order. I will have you grounded for the rest of your career. There's a window, Colonel," Sharma's voice replied, calm amidst the rising storm and the Colonel's anger. "It's closing. Pathfinder doesn't have a career to worry about." Before Thorn could respond, the roar of afterburners shook the entire base. On the screen, her icon accelerated down the runway and lifted into the maelstrom. It vanished from the base's primary radar almost immediately, swallowed by the storm. Thorn stood frozen for a moment, his authority utterly disregarded. Then, his training took over. The pilot was in the air. The mission, whether he'd authorized it or not, was live. "Give me a link to her avionics," he snapped at the controller. "I want to see what she's seeing. And give me a direct line to Pathfinder's frequency. If she's going in, she's not going in blind." His tone had changed. The anger was still there, but it was now welded to a grim, pragmatic focus. Sharma had forced his hand. Now, he had to play the card she'd dealt. The flight into the storm was a brutal, physical assault. The Ghost shuddered and bucked as it hit the storm wall, a violent transition from smooth air to a churning vortex of wind and water. Inside the cockpit, Sharma was strapped tightly into her seat, but her body was still thrown against the restraints. Alarms blared, a cacophony of electronic shrieks warning of wind shear, icing, and proximity to the terrain. She ignored them all. Her focus narrowed to the sliver of data on her heads-up display and the feel of the aircraft through the control stick. She wasn't fighting the storm. She was flowing with it, making minute adjustments, anticipating the gusts, letting the turbulence carry her where she needed to go. Rain hammered against the canopy, a solid wall of water that obscured everything. She was flying blind, relying entirely on her instruments. The terrain-following radar painted a ghostly green image of the mountains ahead on her display, a treacherous landscape of jagged peaks and sudden drops. She kept the jet low, barely 100 feet above the treetops, the radar altimeter screaming its proximity warning. This was where other pilots would have pulled up, aborted. This was Sharma's natural environment. She descended further, pushing into the thermal inversion layer she had predicted. Just as her instruments indicated, the air suddenly smoothed out. The violent bucking ceased, replaced by a steady, powerful pressure. She was in the tunnel. It was like flying down a mineshaft. Below her, the rocky floor of the canyon. Above her, the roiling, violent belly of the storm. On either side, sheer granite walls, so close she felt she could reach out and touch them. Lightning flashed, illuminating the claustrophobic corridor in stark, momentary detail, revealing the terrifying speed at which the rock faces rushed past. Her radar warning receiver, silent until now, suddenly chirped to life. A search radar, somewhere ahead. Then another. They were sweeping, hunting for her. She was a ghost in their machine, the storm providing natural cover, but they knew something was coming. She throttled back, letting the jet sink lower, putting another layer of rock and atmospheric distortion between her and the emitters. Her gloved fingers danced across the control panel, switching her own radar to a passive, listen-only mode. She wouldn't give them a signal to lock onto. She would find them first. The TOC was receiving her data feed in broken bursts, the storm corrupting the signal. Thorne watched the fragmented images on the main screen, a glimpse of a canyon wall, a flash of the HUD with altitude warnings screaming, a momentary radar contact. It was like watching a horror movie through a keyhole. "Can you raise Pathfinder?" Thorne demanded. "Still trying, sir," the comms officer replied, his hands flying across his console. "The interference is too strong." Sharma didn't need the TOC to find them. She had their last known coordinates, and she had her instincts. She saw a flicker of movement on her infrared display, a heat signature that didn't belong. A plume of hot gas, venting from behind a rock slide. A mortar tube. It fired again, a brief, intense flare of white heat. The shell arced up, invisible in the storm, on its way to Pathfinder's position. Sharma didn't hesitate. Her thumb selected the small-diameter bombs. The targeting pod under her fuselage swiveled, its sensors locking onto the heat source. On her display, a green box snapped around the target. It was a difficult shot. The bomb had to be released at the perfect moment to clear a rocky overhang and hit the concealed position. There was no room for error. She didn't have enough altitude to let the bomb's own guidance system do the work. She had to fly the weapon to the target herself. She rolled the aircraft slightly, lining up the shot, her eyes tracking the solution on the HUD. A small chime indicated a solid lock. She squeezed the trigger on her control stick. There was no massive explosion, just a slight shudder as the SDB dropped from the pylon. It was a small, precise weapon, a surgeon's scalpel. It fell for a few seconds, its fins deploying, then its small rocket motor fired, guiding it on its final path. On her screen, the heat signature of the mortar vanished in a brief, contained flash of light. The threat was neutralized. The entire action had taken less than 15 seconds. On the ground, Sergeant Diaz and his 3 remaining team members were pressed against the cold rock, the sound of the incoming mortar a familiar, terrifying whistle. They braced for the impact. Instead, there was silence. The whistling stopped. A moment later, a low, guttural roar echoed through the canyon, a sound that wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a jet engine, impossibly close. Diaz risked a look, peering through the driving rain. For a split second, a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, and he saw it. A dark, predatory shape, impossibly low, its wings swept back, trailing vapor from its wingtips. It was there, and then it was gone, swallowed by the storm as quickly as it had appeared. He fumbled for his radio, switching to the emergency guard frequency. "All stations, this is Pathfinder Actual. We just had an angel on our shoulder. Unknown aircraft just took out the mortar position. I repeat, threat is neutralized. Who the hell is up there?" Back in the TOC, Diaz's voice came through with surprising clarity for a moment. The room, which had been holding its collective breath, erupted in a quiet murmur. Thorne stepped up to the comms console. He looked at Sharma's icon on the map, a single, steady light in the heart of the storm. "Pathfinder, this is Big Eye," Thorne said, his voice steady. "Your angel's call sign is Wraith. She's on station," the name hung in the air. Wraith. It was a call sign whispered on the flight lines, a name attached to stories that sounded more like fiction than fact. The pilot who flew through a sandstorm to rescue a downed crew. The one who outmaneuvered 6 enemy fighters in a training exercise. Thorne had always dismissed them as hangar myths. Now, he was watching one being written in real time. He keyed his mic again, this time on Sharma's private channel. "Wraith, this is Thorne. Good hit. What's your status?" "Fuel at 60%. Multiple search radars active." Her voice came back, as calm as if she were ordering coffee. "They know I'm here now," she was right. The valley had woken up. Taking out the mortar had been like kicking a hornet's nest. Her threat display lit up like a Christmas tree. Multiple radar systems were now painting her, their electronic beams sweeping the canyon, trying to get a solid lock through the storm's interference. A new tone, a high-pitched, insistent warble, sounded in her headset. A missile launch warning. A mobile SAM launcher, hidden in a side ravine, had gotten a fleeting lock and fired. She jinked the aircraft hard left, the G-forces squeezing her into her seat, her vision graying at the edges. A cloud of chaff and flares erupted from the back of the jet, a shower of electronic and thermal decoys. She watched the missile streak past her canopy on the display, a thin red line that went ballistic as it lost its lock, chasing the flares into a granite wall. The explosion was a dull thud she felt through the airframe. But it was the other new contacts that worried her more. Two icons, moving fast from the north end of the valley. Interceptors. The enemy had scrambled a pair of older MiG-29s, twin-tailed fighters that were nimble and deadly in a close-range knife fight. They were descending into the canyon after her, their pilots likely experienced in these conditions. They couldn't use their long-range missiles in this weather, which meant they would have to get close, relying on their cannons and heat-seeking missiles. This was no longer a simple strike mission. It was a brawl in a phone booth. Wraith, you have two bandits, closing from your 12 o'clock, 10 miles. Thorn's voice crackled in her ear. The dismissal was gone. He was her eyes now, his team feeding her every scrap of data they could pull through the storm. Pathfinder reports enemy armor moving up the main canyon road. They're trying to cut off the extraction point. Copy, Sharma said. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations. Fuel, weapons, threats, time. The ground team was the priority. But she couldn't help them if she was shot down. The MiGs had to be dealt with first. She looked at the terrain map on her display. The main canyon was a death trap, but a smaller, narrower tributary snaked off to the east. The charts called it the Serpent's Tooth. It was barely wider than her wingspan in places, a suicidal course for any sane pilot. It was perfect. I'm drawing the bandits into the side canyon, she transmitted. Tell Pathfinder to move to the extraction point now. I'll buy them time, Wraith. The terrain models show that canyon is a dead end, Thorn protested. There's no way out. There's always a way, she replied, her voice flat. She pushed the stick forward, diving toward the canyon floor, the two enemy fighters tied on her tail. The entrance to the Serpent's Tooth was a dark slash in the rock face. Flying into it felt like being swallowed. The world outside the canopy dissolved into a blur of gray rock and mist. The space was so tight that her wingtip vortices scraped against the canyon walls, sending sheets of water and loose gravel cascading into the air. The two MiGs followed her in, their pilots skilled but more cautious. They were hunters, and she was the cornered prey. They assumed she had made a fatal mistake. Sharma let them get closer, watching their icons creep up on her tactical display. She needed them committed, deep inside the narrowest part of the canyon where they had no room to maneuver. The launch warning for a heat-seeking missile screamed in her ears. One of the MiGs had a lock. This was the moment. She slammed the throttles to their stops, the afterburners kicking in with a physical jolt that slammed her back in her seat. The Ghost leaped forward, accelerating with brutal force. But she didn't try to outrun them. Instead, she did the last thing they would expect. She pulled the stick back hard, into her lap, and kicked the rudder. It was a maneuver that existed only in theory, a high-G, post-stall reversal that put incredible stress on both the pilot and the airframe. The jet responded instantly. Its nose pitched up violently, the aircraft standing on its tail, its forward momentum bleeding off in seconds. For a heart-stopping moment, the Ghost was effectively stationary in the air, hanging by its thrust, before it began to slide backward, falling tail-first down the canyon. The lead MiG pilot, caught completely by surprise, shot past underneath her, his missiles screaming off into the empty space where she had been a second before. As her jet fell, Sharma had already pushed the stick forward, regaining airflow over her control surfaces. The Ghost's nose dropped, and she found herself perfectly positioned, falling in behind the two enemy fighters. They were no longer the hunters. They were the prey. The second MiG pilot saw her in his mirrors, a demonic shape appearing from nowhere, and broke hard, his wings scraping the canyon wall in his panic. It was too late. Sharma's systems had already achieved a weapons lock. Two short-range missiles leaped from her wing rails. They didn't have far to travel. The explosions were brutally intimate in the confined space, a double concussion of fire and shrapnel that vaporized both enemy aircraft. The shockwave hit her jet like a hammer, and she fought the controls to keep from being slammed into the wall herself. She flew through the expanding fireball of her own kills, her cockpit lit by the momentary, hellish orange glow. The canyon ahead was, as Thorn had warned, a dead end, culminating in a sheer, 1,000-foot waterfall. But Sharma had seen it on the map. She had planned for it. She kept the afterburners lit, pointing her nose directly at the cliff face. Thorn's voice was tense in her ear. Wraith, report. What was that? You're heading for a box wall. Just clearing the board. she said, her breathing steady despite the crushing G-forces. At the last possible second, as the granite wall filled her entire view, she pulled the jet vertical. The Ghost climbed, clawing its way up the face of the waterfall, the engines screaming in protest as they ingested gallons of cold water. She broke through the top of the canyon and the storm's inversion layers simultaneously, bursting back into the violent, turbulent heart of the tempest. For a few seconds, she was a blind animal, tossed by the wind, before she wrestled the jet back under control and dove back down into the relative calm of the main canyon. The entire engagement, from entering the Serpent's Tooth to emerging victorious, had taken less than 90 seconds. Back on the canyon floor, she had a new problem. Her fuel gauge was dropping at an alarming rate, and the low fuel warning light was now glowing with a steady, ominous amber. The fight with the MiGs had been costly. Worse, the enemy armor column Pathfinder had warned about was now visible, a line of armored personnel carriers and a single T-90 tank grinding their way toward the small, rocky plateau designated as the extraction point. Pathfinder was halfway there, exposed and running out of time. The extraction helicopter was still 5 minutes out, hovering on the far side of the ridge, unable to enter the canyon until the armor was dealt with. It all came down to her. "Thorn, I'm bingo fuel," she reported, using the pilot's term for critically low fuel. "I have one pass. Rockets and cannon only." The gravity of her words settled over the Tosi. One pass. She had to stop an entire armored column in a single run, with unguided rockets and a 20mm cannon, while flying on fumes. It was impossible. "Copy, Wraith," Thorn said. His voice was strained, but there was a new tone in it now. Not skepticism, not even professional detachment. It was respect. "Make it count." Sharma lined up her attack run, flying low and fast down the length of the canyon. The armored column saw her coming. Red tracers from their heavy machine guns reached out for her, a lattice of deadly light crisscrossing the gray air. The ZSU she had evaded earlier opened up again, its radar-guided cannons filling the sky with flak. She ignored it all. Her focus was absolute. The lead vehicle was the T-90 tank. It was the key. Take it out, and it would block the narrow road, bottling up the rest of the column. She selected the rocket pods. The targeting pipper on her HUD drifted over the tank. She held the jet steady, a Herculean effort against the turbulence and the incoming fire. A shell exploded off her right wing, and the aircraft shuddered violently. A new alarm screamed, warning of damage to a control surface. She compensated with the rudder, keeping her nose locked on the target. "Now," she whispered to herself. Her thumb pressed the release. A stream of rockets erupted from the pods under her wings, a volley of high-explosive fury that streaked across the short distance to the tank. The impact was devastating. The rockets tore through the tank's thinner top armor, and its turret blew off in a spectacular eruption of fire and smoke. The burning hulk slewed sideways, completely blocking the road. The APCs behind it ground to a halt, a perfect, stationary line of targets. She was already past them, but she pulled the jet into a tight, high-G turn that threatened to tear the wings off. The damage alarm shrieked in protest. She came around for her cannon run, flying straight at the trapped column. The nose of the Ghost lit up as the 20mm Gatling gun opened fire. The sound was a visceral roar that vibrated through her entire body. A stream of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, firing at a rate of 100 per second, tore into the thin-skinned APCs. Metal shredded, fuel tanks ignited, and one by one, the vehicles exploded, turning the canyon road into a junkyard of burning steel. Her pass complete, she pulled up, her fuel warning now a critical, flashing red. She had seconds of flight time left. "Pathfinder, your ride is clear," she transmitted, her voice tight from the strain. "Extraction zone is secure, solid copy, Wraith." Diaz's voice was jubilant. "We see the chopper. We're popping smoke." "Goddamn, Wraith, you're a legend." Sharma didn't have time to acknowledge the praise. She was fighting to keep her dying aircraft in the air. The engines began to sputter as they starved for fuel. She was too low to eject. She had to glide it. She coaxed the battered jet over the final ridge, the silence in the cockpit deafening now that the engines had finally flamed out. The airfield was just ahead. She could make it. In the Tactical Operations Center, They had watched the entire sequence in stunned silence. The screens showed the destruction of the armored column, the green icon of the extraction helicopter moving into the canyon, and the 4 members of Pathfinder being lifted to safety. But all eyes were on Wraith's icon, now blinking red, showing 0 fuel and multiple system failures as it glided toward the base. No one spoke. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Colonel Thorne stood motionless, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of a chair. He had sent men on impossible missions before. He had lost them. He had reconciled himself to the cold logic of command. But this was different. He had tried to stop her. He had called her a fool. And she had gone anyway, trading her life and her aircraft for soldiers he had already written off. He watched her icon crawl over the base perimeter. It was going to be close. He found himself holding his breath, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. The entire room was silent, a vigil of screens and hushed professionals. Then, the tower's frequency crackled over the speakers. "Ghost is on the deck." "Repeat, Ghost is on the deck." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room. A few operators clapped, a spontaneous burst of applause that quickly died down. Thorne keyed his mic, his voice hoarse. "Wraith, good work." Returned to base, he realized the absurdity of his words as soon as he said them. She was already here. He paused, then added, his voice low and clear for the entire room to hear. "Welcome home, Major." The Ghost was a wreck. It rolled to a stop at the end of the runway, its tires blown, one wing riddled with holes, and a long, dark scorch mark marring its fuselage where the flak had exploded. The canopy hissed open, and Anya Sharma climbed out. She didn't look tired. She looked energized, her eyes bright with the residual fire of combat. She did a slow walk around of her aircraft, her hand once again resting on its battered skin, assessing the damage, thanking her silent partner for bringing her home. Airman Leo Vance was the first to reach her, driving a maintenance vehicle. He didn't say a word, just jumped out and handed her a cold bottle of water. His eyes were wide with a reverence that bordered on worship. He looked from the pilot to the savaged machine and back again. He had rearmed a jet against a direct order. He had been an accessory to the most flagrant act of insubordination he'd ever seen, and he had never been more proud of anything in his life. As the first rays of dawn broke through the receding storm clouds, a command vehicle pulled up a short distance away. Colonel Marcus Thorne stepped out. He didn't approach Sharma. He simply stood there, watching as the fire crews began to foam down the hot brakes of the jet. He looked at the pilot, her flight suit soaked with rain and sweat, her face smudged with grime. He looked at the impossible damage to her aircraft. He thought of the 4 men now safe in the med bay, men who were alive only because this woman had defied him. His entire worldview, built on a foundation of procedure, regulation, and calculated risk, had been fractured. She had operated on a different level, a plane of instinct and raw ability that his manuals could never account for. She hadn't just broken the rules, she had proven them irrelevant. Sharma met his gaze across the wet tarmac. There was no triumph in her expression, no, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, unyielding calm. Thorne raised his hand in a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't the perfunctory gesture of a superior officer. It was a sign of profound, earned respect. Anya Sharma didn't salute back. She simply gave him a short, crisp nod of acknowledgement, then turned her attention back to her jet. The metal skin was ticking and groaning as it cooled, the only sound in the quiet dawn. The storm was over. The silence that remained was filled with the weight of her actions.